Hi, I'm International Master Danny Wrench, Chief Chess Officer at Chess.com. Chess is an ancient board game. It dates back as far as 600 AD and is played on a 64-square board, rotating between 32 dark and 32 light squares. You're going to learn how each piece moves, that the goal of the game is to checkmate the enemy king, how to set up a chessboard, and more. Let's jump in. When I teach chess, I like to start with the easiest pieces to understand first, moving our way toward the more complicated movements. Let's start with the rook. Each player has two rooks, and they start in the corners of the board. A rook is often called a castle by beginner chess players, but the true and proper name is a rook. Rooks are the second most powerful piece on the board, and their movement is extremely simple to understand. They can go up and down, or side to side, in any one direction as far as they desire. The next easiest piece to understand is the bishop. Each player also begins with two bishops, just like the rooks. But unlike the rooks, we forever will have a light square and a dark square bishop. Bishops are stuck to their respective starting diagonal for the rest of the game. They can move along these diagonals as far as they want in any one direction, one move at a time. However, they are never allowed to cross over to the other diagonal. Chess players often refer to the board as having a dark squared bishop or a light squared bishop. The next piece to learn is the queen. Her Majesty is by far the most powerful piece on the chessboard. She combines the powers of a rook and a bishop together. That means from a square like this, she might at one point move like a rook as far as she wants on the straight lines of the board, or in this case, like a light square bishop, reaching as far as she wants to the furthest corners and diagonals of the chessboard. She can move as far as her heart desires as long as she doesn't run into another piece and maintains the movements of a rook or a bishop. Now it's time to learn about the knight. Because of its equine appearance, a knight is often referred to as a horse by beginner chess players. But as a true chess player after watching this video, you will now refer to this noble steed by its proper name, the knight. A knight moves like a capital L in any one direction. Two squares forward and one square to the side. Depending on the direction that it starts to, it stays moving two squares within that direction before completing the movement, as we can see, like a capital L to find its final square. A knight is also the only piece that can hop over another piece on the way to its final destination. In this example, we have a black pawn taking away the knight's route to the square b6 or b4. However, the knight is not actually prevented from going to this square. It hops right over the enemy piece. Often beginner players assume that because they hop through this piece to their final square, that they can take this piece off the board. That is not the case. The knight is seen as bypassing any pieces on its route to its final square. You would, however, capture an enemy piece if that piece were on the final square you're moving to. Now it's time for us to talk about the little guys. The pawns may seem like the lowliest and shortest of your pieces, but they are actually the ones with the most potential and also the most numerous. Each player starts out with 8 pawns, respectively along the 2nd rank for white, 8 pawns respectively along the 7th rank for black. A pawn can only move forward one square at a time, and never can a pawn move backward. However, what we'll learn about the pawn is that there are more exceptions to the movements of how to play with a pawn than all of the other pieces combined. For starters, on the first move only, pawns have the option to move 2 squares forward instead of just 1. Now, this is not an obligation. If one player chooses to move a pawn forward 2 squares, that does not mean the other player has to. You can choose at any time to move forward 1 or 2 squares. But again, a pawn only has the option to go 2 squares on its first move. From then on out, a pawn is stuck moving 1 square at a time. Speaking of exceptions, how to move the pawn. Pawns are the only pieces that capture differently than they move. Here we have two pawns directly opposing each other along the e-file. These two pawns are not able to capture each other should they reach a deadlock in the middle of the board. Pawns only capture diagonally, also only one square in front of them. A pawn cannot capture a pawn directly in front of it. The special rules we have about our pawns continue. Pawns have a unique goal that no other piece has. If it reaches the other side of the board, a pawn has the ability to promote itself to any of the other pieces besides a second king. This is referred to as pawn promotion. Because a pawn does not have the ability to move backwards, if he completes the long journey, the pawn can replace itself with a new queen, or a second queen if you still have one, a rook, a bishop, or a knight. Often the end of the game is set up for the pawns to race each other to see who has the ability to get a new queen, the most common piece chosen, first. Our final rule about the very complicated pieces, known as the pawns, is called en passant. Pawns have a very special move, and it's a move that many even practiced chess players still confuse. The rule works like this. If one of the pawns has reached either the 5th rank for white or the 4th rank for black, this pawn is impinging on the other pawns who may try to move 2 squares directly by the pawn in front of it. Because this was not always the case, long ago pawns were not allowed to move 2 squares on their first move and were required to go 1 square, thus allowing a potential capture. When this rule changed, allowing pawns, if they choose, to move 2 squares directly by a pawn, the rule was also added en passant, which is French for in passing. In this position, if white tried to go 2 squares with a pawn, right beside this pawn on the 4th rank, black would have the option, not the obligation, to capture this pawn en passant. This move only works because the pawn tried to move 2 squares directly by the pawn. If this pawn had moved 1 square, and white chose another random move that turn, we'll make one for an example, and only then move to this square, you would no longer have the ability to capture en passant. The rule was only invented to prevent moving 2 squares directly by a pawn who has worked so hard to reach the 5th or the 4th rank respectively. I have a fun rule I like to say to help my students remember this. If the pawns have ever faced off, that means you have to keep your hands off. So the fact that they had the ability to capture each other, but chose not to, means that there is no longer the ability to en passant. Again, it only works if a pawn tries to move 2 squares by a pawn that has been patiently waiting on the 5th or 4th rank. You did it. We've made it all the way to learning how the king moves. Kings are also complicated, because to checkmate an enemy king is to win the game. But before we get to that, learning how the king moves is actually very easy. The king moves 1 square at a time in any direction it wants. Kings can only go 1 square, but they are actually the only other piece besides the queen that protects and attacks every square physically next to the current square that it stands on. The one trick about that is that kings are not allowed to go to a square if it is currently attacked by an enemy piece. Here's an example where the rook controls the entire e-file. So this king, while it can still go to d4, c4, c5, c6, and d6, the king cannot access e4, e5, or e6 at this moment, as that would put the king in check. What is check? I'm glad you asked. Check in chess is when a king has come under attack by an enemy piece. In this position, the white queen has several ways to put the black king in check. She can move like a rook up to the 6th rank, placing a direct attack on the king. Likewise, she could move like a rook to the first rank, delivering an attack along the f-file. Moving like a rook to b2 would also be delivering a check if you consider the queen's movement like a bishop along the dark square diagonal. Respectively, a1, as well as the squares f5 and g6 would all be moves that the queen could do to attack the enemy king in this position. When the king is in check, you should look for 3 ways to get out of it. Now that we've added the black rook, if the white queen were to move to the b2 square, black would actually have all 3 of these options at his disposal. The first way to get out of check, and often the most common one should look for, is can I capture the enemy piece that is attacking my king? In this position, black could actually move the rook from e2 to b2 and capture the piece that is attacking his leader. Often the second option you should look for when your king is under attack is if you can block the piece that's checking your king. In this case, the rook could also move backward to the square e5, which, by interposing the diagonal between the queen and the king, the rook has blocked the check to the king on f6. The third option to get out of check is simply to move the king to safety. Black could move the king to f5, g5, g6, f7, e7, or e6 to get out of check here. Note that neither g7, still in check, nor e5 get out of check. Those 2 squares would not be legal for the king to find safety. It's time to learn how a chess game is won. Checkmate is when a king is under fire, just as I showed in the last example, but none of the 3 options, to capture, block, or run away, is available to the king. This is called checkmate, and it ends the game immediately. In this position, black actually has several ways to deliver checkmate to the white king. The first and most common is what we refer to as a helper mate. The queen has placed herself directly in front of the white king. This king clearly cannot find safety on either of these 2 squares, as they are attacked by the enemy